number one, the most important thing for health and longevity and really the quality of your life is really going to be skeletal muscle. It's not just at the foundation for health, but it is your physical foundation. Therefore, let's say you have a healthy heart and a healthy thyroid. All of this means nothing if you cannot get up and move. Period. End of story. You have to be able to manage your house and structure as a human. So skeletal muscle is the foundation for this. And then many of these diseases of Western society that we're seeing, these metabolic related diseases, have a huge relationship to the health of your skeletal muscle. And that's really key. And then the way in which you maintain the health of your skeletal muscle is through dietary protein, very specifically, and resistance exercise, strength exercise, any kind of, and that is the way in which you move skeletal muscle, which is under your voluntary control, is key.
Welcome my guest, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. She is the founder of the Institute of Muscle Centric-Medicine. She services the leaders, innovators, mavericks, and executives in their prospective fields. In addition, Gabrielle worked closely with special operations military and a private practice that serves patients worldwide. Dr. Lyon is a Washington University fellow-trained physician. Her postdoctoral training was a combined research and clinical medicine fellowship in nutritional science, obesity medicine, and geriatrics. She is also board certified in family medicine. Dr. Lyon completed her undergraduate degree at Human Nutrition, Vitamin, and Mineral Metabolism at the University of Illinois and continues to be mentored over the last 2 decades by one of the world's leading protein experts, Dr. Donald Layman. Her goal is to change the paradigm of medicine from obesity-focused to muscle-centric and change the way we think about health and medicine with high scientific integrity. All right, welcome to another episode on Passion, Love, Pursuit. I've been anxiously waiting for this podcast episode with my guest today, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been an honor. I've been following you for some time and I've been listening to so many of your episodes on other podcasts. And I feel every single time I learn something more because you have so much knowledge in this area that we're going to talk about today. And you're kind of the leading expert that is really paving the way to get this message across, which is about the importance of protein and skeletal muscle, which I know, or many people probably listening have heard maybe other knowledge in regards to longevity and protein. And so I kind of want you to reveal the other side of the importance of skeletal muscle and protein. So let's just kind of jump right in it. Usually I like to get into somebody's story, but I just want to actually absorb all the information you're going to provide in this episode today. So can you kind of explain this controversy between protein and longevity and what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You bring up a good point that if someone is new to the health and wellness space, if you jump on to any kind of platform, you'll hear a handful of longevity experts talking about some very specific things. And those specific things include dietary protein restriction, total calorie restriction, and, I think that those are the two biggest things that you hear these longevity experts talk about. And one thing to point out is that you'll notice it's just really a handful of individuals. And it's a handful of very good scientists with a particular perspective that I think is kind of overshadowing the rest of individuals like myself who are either trained in aging. So I'm a trained geriatrician from WashU, which is a pretty prestigious institution and specializing in individuals over the age of 65. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because I specialize in aging from a clinical perspective, not a research perspective, even though I did do 2 years of clinical research. My wheelhouse is in treating patients and actually being in the trenches of patient care and management. And I will tell you, number one, for longevity, we first must define, are we thinking about the length of time versus quality of life? So, what does that mean? That means, is it more beneficial for someone to live to 100, or is it more to be 100 who is bedridden and unable to do their activities of daily living? Or is it more beneficial for an individual to live to the age of 95, fully strong, fully capable, and able to maintain their quality of life? So we have to reframe the concept of, quote, longevity into something that is clinically relevant and meaningful. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect of this conversation is this dietary protein restriction for, quote, longevity. The things that I just mentioned, for example, activities of daily living, all require one thing in common, and that's healthy skeletal muscle.
Mm.
There's only two ways to maintain healthy skeletal muscle as you age. That's exercise, and primarily resistance exercise, but exercise in general, and dietary protein. That's it. Those are the only two ways to maintain skeletal muscle. And if longevity, or rather health span, is your goal endpoint, then you must leverage both dietary protein and skeletal muscle. When you ask me this question, what is some of the controversy? The controversy is individuals mechanistically are saying to reduce dietary protein for this conceptual idea of longevity, the golden egg of longevity, which again says nothing about the quality of life. Now I'll take it one step further. And then I want to hear your questions. One step further is, where did this come from? What is the data? Why are people taking a correlation of whatever is mechanistically relevant in the laboratory and then translating that over to humans? Well, number one, much of this data is low quality data, meaning it's likely epidemiology data where you're taking cohorts of people and you're looking at them through a cross-sectional study, which really doesn't do much, because we do have randomized controlled trials that show the importance of dietary protein as it relates to skeletal muscle and aging. Then this concept of protein restriction, where does this come from? And oftentimes it comes from this one pathway called mTOR. And not to get too sciencey for the individuals, but mTOR is this pathway that is a growth promoter, and it's really important and relevant for muscle protein synthesis. So this concept of restricting dietary protein actually blunts this mTOR pathway. So it's almost as if the longevity narrative goes against, so it talks about protein restriction, but it's really almost an anti-muscle narrative.
And so that's what you usually say, is that we should be more muscle centric opposed to fat focused. And so can you
Yeah,
kind of explain this? Because it's so funny. You go into get a checkup at the hospital or whatnot, and they say, like, how much are you doing? I think they say physical activity, but I think
right.
when people think physical activity, they're thinking cardio. So why is it so cardiovascular driven opposed to like actually training and strengthening your muscles?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is just the dichotomy between the fitness world and the medical world. And, rightly so. I totally understand, as a trained physician, you can't be good at everything. And where medicine really is incredible is in its algorithmic nature of treating disease. Once you have a disease state, you are treating this disease endpoint. And, let's say it's diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. There are medications that really should and can be implemented. And so that's great. Where the gap is, and your question is why, where is the disconnect between exercise, physical activity, and health and wellness? And I think that, when you get to the point where you're needing treatment, a physician is really trained to do that. The preventative aspect is what's really missing. So there is not a bridge between really good information in the hands of the physician, and simply because they don't have time. right? There's
Right.
you in order to be really exceptional at disease management, you're spending a lot of your time reading that. There's only so much time in the day, right? So that's where I think kind of the disconnect is in terms of what is most important to the physician. And from my perspective, the most important aspect to the physician is probably treating disease.
Okay, so now how to prevent diseases, because I've heard you speak about
Yeah,
this, that a lot of diseases actually stem from the lack of skeletal muscle. Can you kind of
yeah,
explain this?
yeah, absolutely. And this is my perspective. This is my perspective of being in the research, being a trained geriatrician, and then being mentored by one of the world leading protein experts. So my perspective comes from a combination of the clinical research side and then obviously treating patients and seeing what I've seen over a period of time. And I believe, well, number one, we have to take a step back and recognize that diseases, there's not just one thing that causes diseases. So there's an outcome that happens, right? But there's multiple inputs and multiple mechanistic pathways and multiple things that contribute to this one disease. So, for example, let's take insulin resistance. And if we say insulin resistance or diabetes, there are multiple different pathways that ultimately create an endpoint of diabetes, right? It's not just
Right,
one thing.
of
From
course.
my perspective, there's multiple things that we can't affect, right? So if you have a genetic issue with an insulin receptor, there's multiple things that you cannot affect. But the one thing that you really can affect is skeletal muscle. And as we know, one of the primary sites for insulin resistance, which ultimately goes on to be a proponent of all these other diseases, begin in skeletal muscle.
Hmm.
And I think where the real error is that everybody talks about it one step later as it relates to obesity. By the time that you've put on fat and by the time that you're dealing with extra adiposity, you've already had issues in skeletal muscle, whether it's a decade before, however along that length of time is. And it's really a huge blind spot in the medical community and in how we've gone about treating and caretaking these diseases. We are starting at obesity or adipose
Right.
tissue when we really should be starting in skeletal muscle.
It's so interesting that that's why I love that you talk about this, because I've been working out since I was probably like 15, but before, when I was younger, from the little bit I knew, it was more like I got to do cardio because I need to burn fat, and then I got to do training as well. I was doing training at this point, but I just remember like there's a lot of people that lean so much on cardio for losing weight. And let's say over 10 years ago, I realized I'm like, okay, I'm not really changing with this cardio and training routine. So I actually started just doing training, and I leaned up so much more by just muscle training. And also I felt more energy. I felt, just more able to move around easy, and I just felt better, right? And so I think that's where the misconception is, that we need to do all this cardio exercise to lose weight and to not be obese and to get at this ideal weight, where people are neglecting the importance of resistance training. So what would you
Yeah,
say about that? Because that's
I would.
the crazy thing. I
Yeah,
think people need to hear that. So,
I would say that you're absolutely right, and that's actually where muscle-centric medicine was born from. I had this flash of insight, and it was during the time I was doing my fellowship, and my fellowship at WashU was a combination of clinical geriatrics, right? So taking care of those patients. But the other side of my responsibilities was running an obesity weight loss clinic and then doing obesity research and looking at the interface between, so the one project, every fellow has a project, and my project was looking at the interface between body weight and cognitive function. So we were
mm,
doing fMRI studies. It was part of this very complex comprehensive study that had multiple arms to it. And one of the things that happened was I was imaging this woman's brain, and she was a mom of three children, and she was in her late, maybe somewhere in her 50s. She was on the yo-yo diet train, and she was doing cardio and on the yo-yo diet train, and she had always lost, the last 15 to 20 pounds, always fighting with it. And I imaged her brain, and her brain looked like the
wow.
Alzheimer's brains and the dementia brains. And it was at that moment that I realized that the information that we had constantly been telling people, and I took it very personally, and whether I should or shouldn't, I felt like as a medical society, we were failing.
Mm.
And I was contributing to that. So I felt that I was failing and that I was failing these individuals, that here this woman was just following the directions of what she was told, do more cardio, go to Jenny Craig. And she was on this perpetual cycle of yo-yo dieting. And, it wasn't that they all had fat in common. It's that all these people had low muscle mass or low quality muscle. And, that's where I realized, that's where actually muscle centric medicine was born, in this flash of insight, that this idea that skeletal muscle is really the pinnacle and really the centerpiece for all health. And that,
Mhm.
you know, um, when we think about things in medicine and nutrition, they often fall under paradigms of thinking. So this is this silo of thinking, this is this silo of thinking. And, especially as it relates to obesity, the silo of thinking is, again, adiposity, do cardiovascular activity. And again, it hasn't served us well. And when you ask the right question, if the question is correct, you have a much greater chance of getting to an answer that is effective. So if the question is correct, then the effectiveness of the answer is amplified.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it was just this constant yo-yo for everybody that I was seeing. So do I think that there is a disconnect, and you know is cardiovascular activity going to move body composition significantly? No, it's not. The way to really improve body composition is by really focusing on muscular adaptations. And you could argue, is it strength or hypertrophy? I think it can always be stronger, so you can train for strength. I also think that you need to train for hypertrophy. And listen, this is my opinion. People might argue you don't need to train for hypertrophy, but again, as a geriatrician, when you train for hypertrophy, you're really focusing on building your body armor. And it's not an if, it's a when. It's not an if something is going to happen. It's a when, unfortunately. So you have to be prepared for it.
It's so let's really talk a little deeper about that, because as you talk about, muscle is the organ of longevity, and so as we age, especially,
Yeah.
it's so critical. And I know, you've talked about this before, is because it's so common, and we definitely know this, that people fall as they get older. And
Yeah.
what would you say to that? The reason people are falling, is it because they do not have the muscle stability that will support their body? And there might be a few factors, but what would you
Yeah,
say
there's
about that?
definitely there's multiple factors for a fall. And again, some factors we can control for and some that we can't. I think that you cannot dismiss the fact that physical training is going to be your biggest influence to prevent these falls. It's one of the leading causes of deaths over the age of 65. And we've all had elder parents or older individuals in our community. And the majority of the time, when these individuals fall, the trajectory of their life totally changes.
Wow.
Whether they have to be on a walker or you'll see a sudden decline, and it's really devastating. And your question to me is what is the cause, or what can be done? And that is definitely balance training, resistance training, even some type of plyometric dynamic explosive training. And it doesn't have to be crazy. For some people, that could be sitting from standing if they're totally deconditioned, but also being able to fall well, being able to step off a box and not injure yourself.
Mm.
And the problem, when I think about cardio, the problem with cardio and other types of fitness modalities is they don't require a lot of thought, and it's better than nothing. Anything is better than nothing. However, training people to manage their environment is critical. And what do I mean by training people to manage to manage their environment? To me, that means to be able to brace yourself against a fall, to be able to take a step off of a step and be able to balance yourself. These are things that are really missed if an individual is just doing cardio on a bike or just on a treadmill. It doesn't, you fall, you see this in anything, you fall to your level of training, right? You don't
Mm.
rise to any occasion. And that goes for medical training and any kind of crisis management. You always, and I'm using the word fall, that's like a proverbial fall, but you will always go to your highest level of training. And so if an individual has only trained doing the bike and they trip and they fall on their outstretched hand, what's going to happen? Versus knowing that they can do push ups or knowing that they can step off a box, any of those things.
Yeah. One of the things I love, and I don't know if you know the Legree Method by Sebastian Legree. It's like the
Yeah, I don't.
Pilates on, so it's a Pilates machine where you stand up on it. And basically, they could say it's Pilates, but it's actually the
Yeah.
Legree Method, started by Sebastian Legree. And so, what he firmly believes is, with this machine, you're able to get full movement in your hips and get like you're positioned in perfect balance to do the exercises. So
Mhm.
not only are you working your balance, but you're also getting perfect form and you're getting full range of your hip movement, which is super important, especially as we get older. And he strongly has spoken about the heavy weight he believe contributes to longevity. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, what would you say about that, like heavy weight training? Because a lot of women, of course, they're afraid to bulk up, which,
Right.
uh, you and I train. Are we bulked up? No. So what would you say about heavy weights, and what is your opinion on longevity for heavy weight training?
I think when you discuss heavy weight training, we're really talking about strength. And, I just interviewed someone on my podcast on this very topic, Dr. Samuel Buckner. And, the data would support that there is this continuum and that as long as you are generating a certain adaptation, whether that's muscular failure, right? You don't have to do every rep to failure, but generating a certain amount of force and effort that ultimately creates failure, on some reps and sets would be very, very valuable. So, could you do lower weight and much higher reps? Yeah. And could you get a certain stimulus and hypertrophy response? Yes. Would that be ideal for strength? And strength is different than hypertrophy. And
Mhm.
I would say that there is not a replacement for really, if the goal is strength and being optimized at strength. I don't necessarily think that there's a replacement to, putting an effort under those heavy loads. Now, I will say, what does that mean for injury? So, as individuals age, depending on their conditioning, if you are now putting them under heavy loads, are you putting them at increased risk that's going to take them out? Because
Mhm.
there's other things to think about just above and beyond muscle mass, which would be bone, whether they're osteoporotic or osteopenic. You could say yes that they should be lifting, but at some point you may have to proceed with caution, especially if you're thinking about form and those kinds of things. Therefore, ultimately, I would say you should impart some kind of heavier strength training. And again, this really depends on the goal of the individual and the adaptation. Is it 100% necessary? And could you still get same benefits or at least great benefit from doing lower strength? Yeah. Or lower weights? Yes.
Yes, it does. So when it comes to longevity, does it matter the quality of the muscle? Meaning, like, let's say somebody bodybuilding and they're really
Yeah.
increasing their muscle mass, or somebody doing Pilates and they're really strengthening their skeletal muscle. Would there be a difference when it comes to longevity?
This is a very good question. And I think that most people have not put this question together. So good job on that.
Thanks.
And this idea that bodybuilders, people look at bodybuilders and they go, okay, well, they don't really live long. And is it related to the amount of muscle mass they have? Or, in my professional opinion, it's probably not related to the amount of muscle mass. But let's take the bodybuilders that are pushing hormones to a super physiologic level, and that is above and beyond which would be in a normal range for any human. I think that there may be some detriment to those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I don't think it's directly related to muscle mass per se, but then again, it's not like we have randomized control trials to say that if you have this amount of muscle, you're going to be healthier.
Right.
Um, in terms of, listen, there are studies that show that the more healthy muscle mass you have, the greater your ability to survive against a disease. Bodybuilders are kind of a breed of their own because they've now put on supra physiologic levels of muscle mass. So there's
Right.
that. So we have to kind of keep that into consideration. And then the other extreme that you're talking about is the individuals that are just doing yoga and Pilates. I think that one or the other is not the way to go, right? There needs to be a middle ground for longevity, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that Pilates is the way in which you are going to optimize strength or hypertrophy. Is it beneficial? Surely. Is it going to take the place of appropriately like progressive overload resistance training with movements like squats? I think there comes a point in time where utilizing um, weights would be beneficial, like above and beyond body weights and bands. If you choose to do that, that's totally relevant and fine. Like some people can do it, and there are some apparatuses that can do it, but is that the majority of individuals? I would say no. The majority of individuals are not utilizing that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then again, for longevity, I don't think that longevity is the end point. I think that it's really health span and quality of life.
100%. And I think that's really important. And I love that you talk about because I've had, oh gosh, Longo, what's his name? Not Victor,
Walter Longo.
Walter
Yeah.
Longo. I've had somebody that works side by side with him, and I remember when I was doing this interview, that subject came up about protein, like if you, for longevity, to reduce your protein intake. That was the first time I heard about it, and I was like, wow, that's so interesting, because I always make sure to have protein with every meal, because in my mind it's always stuck in my head that I need protein to build muscle, right? So
Well, and you need protein for full body turnover. I mean, these are essential amino acids. So if you hit the needs of skeletal muscle, you'll get it for everything else, but you need it for neurotransmitter function. The body goes through 250 or more grams of protein turnover a day for all skin, organs, everything. Um, so from my perspective, Walter Longo, would you want to do chronic protein restriction? Absolutely not. Is there room for cyclical protein restriction for this idea of autophagy or proteostasis or even hormesis? Yes, ways in which you can go through cellular cleaning, but there's multiple different ways in which you can push each lever. But by saying protein restriction overall is a good strategy, I think is not good.
and hasn't it been said also that protein ages us?
How?
I don't
So
know.
I don't think that it's one macronutrient. I mean, so what's the mechanism of action for that? Is it protein or is it excess calories?
Mm,
It's probably excess calories. But if you ask someone that hates animal products, then it's probably protein,
true.
right? So it's not a protein issue. This is not a carbohydrate issue. This is not a fat issue. Arguably, it's a total caloric load issue.
Mhm.
And yeah,
So we talked about the skeletal muscle and the importance of how that is to prevent disease, to prevent any possible quality of life, that we need to actually create that resistance training to build our skeletal muscle. And I believe what our skeletal muscle is about 40 something percent of our body weight. Is that right?
yeah,
Okay.
yep.
So
And if you ask my husband, it's 50% of his. No, I'm just kidding.
that's awesome. So So let's talk about protein, because you said there's resistance training and there's protein. That's the only thing
Yeah.
that will build our skeletal muscles. So the importance of protein. So we talked about the protein restriction that's being the narrative passed around, especially among vegans. And this is not to pick a side one way or the other. I personally eat meat. It works for my body. And so let's go deeper into the protein aspect. What should we actually be doing?
Yeah.
What is your opinion on all of
Yeah,
this?
you bet. I'd love to chat with you about it. And before we move on from, to just also provide a little more context for people in terms of muscle, Muscle is this organ of longevity, which I talk about a lot. It is also the site for glucose disposal. So these diseases like obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, muscle is one of the primary sites for glucose disposal. For all the foods that you're eating, you do have fatty acid oxidation in skeletal muscle as well as glucose disposal. So skeletal muscle, yes, there's this fitness component that we talked about. It's so much more versatile than that. And in fact, the fitness component in my mind is low on the totem pole to the benefits of skeletal muscle. It's also an immune regulator. So when skeletal muscle is an endocrine organ, and when it is contracted, it does release these proteins called myokines that go throughout the body and can help regulate the immune system. So exercise in and of itself is critical in terms of all the other things we talked about, but also because of what the skeletal muscle does and what it releases as an endocrine organ. So now, by understanding that, you will understand the critical aspect of why we have to protect muscle at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
How do we protect muscle? Well, resistance exercise and, any kind of exercise, but really as we age, putting in that effortful training is key. And also when you are in your growth years, like adolescence and while you're during puberty, when you're laying down the foundation for your natural strength. And that's really key. So for those of your listeners who are not in adolescence anymore, or let me say biological adolescence,
Yeah, there you
is
go.
that, mom jokes coming in hot, is
Yeah.
that really understanding that the health of skeletal muscle is dependent on, of course, the movement and then what you feed it. And this is where it becomes very important and imperative to understand that protein is an essential macronutrient. What does that mean? That means that out of carbohydrates, we don't need that. We can generate it. Fat, there's a small amount of essential fatty acids that are required. And then dietary protein, out of the 20 amino acids, 9 are critically essential. Our bodies cannot make them. And we actually eat for those 9 essential amino acids. And of those 9 essential amino acids, they come from foods. And these foods, and this is where the concept of protein quality comes in. So the amount of the essential amino acids determine protein quality. Meaning if, in every 3 ounces of this particular food, how much of the essential amino acids are met, how much are these? And so animal-based products have the highest amount of essential amino acids. And a good way to think about that is that animals have the correct composition of amino acids, that their tissues have the correct essential amino acid composition to feed humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
So animal-based muscle tissue has the same amount, it's very close in amino acid profile to our muscle tissue.
Mm. So let me
So
ask you just before you continue on that, is this go to all animal proteins, would you say? Chicken, beef, egg?
all gravity bearing animals, meaning if it walks, runs, or flies. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Swimming. So fish have a little lower amino acid content, but you can certainly make up for that.
Great.
And then plants, and you can just think about it from a structure perspective, and then plants have the correct amino acid profile to optimize plants. So just they are lower in the essential amino acids. So that's really the definition of high quality protein. It's not an emotional discussion. It's really just based on these essential amino acids and the amount of leucine, isoleucine, and valine and other essential amino acids. So it's not, people get very fired up over the, high quality. What does that mean? And it's really just an old school definition of, the quality of protein. Now, can you get enough plant-based proteins and not consume animal-based products? You absolutely can. It depends on your preference. And the next question I would ask is, why would you eliminate an entire food group of foods that we've been eating for millions of years? To me, conceptually, it doesn't make sense. If someone chose to, for ethical reasons, to get all their proteins from plants, you'll have to consume higher amounts of protein. So if you believe protein is bad for you, but you're going to be plant-based, you actually are going to likely require higher amounts of protein.
Higher amount of calories as well to consume that
Yeah,
quantity of
unless you are
protein,
using processed plant proteins.
right? And so when
And
it
listen,
comes
there's some people
to
that can do it. Yeah, there's some people, I'm sure that if you're really astute, you could eat a lot of tempeh and a lot of soy, and that could be your mainstay of protein, and you probably could get away with consuming, I don't know, 30% more calories. But still, if you're worried about metabolic regulation and you're not as active, or you don't have quite of the carbohydrate tolerance that other people do, this could be a problem.
And so if somebody was vegan or vegetarian and they also are doing resistance training,
Yeah.
would they still be able to have the quality skeletal muscle, the ability to build quality skeletal muscle?
I believe
If
that they can. I
Mhm.
believe, I mean, so do I believe that they can? The evidence would support that they can. Do I believe long term they're going to get their iron needs met and their other food matrix that come in animal based products? No. Choline, creatine, and serine, carnitine, individuals will likely not get these needs met.
So
But can they? Yeah.
would you say supplementation is necessary for vegans or vegetarians based on that?
Well, I think
Like
vegans and
amino,
vegetarians are two separate groups. So, if you're vegan, yes, I think you're going to need supplementation. If you're vegetarian, depends on what you're, depends on the composition of of really what you're eating.
right. Okay. And so let's say eating protein, quality protein, animal protein, how much should the average person get? Let's say the average woman is, I don't know what she is right now. Let's just say 125. And the average male,
That is not
is
the
that
average
right?
woman, by the way. That's the average. That would
I
be
mean,
the
sorry,
average
that's,
woman in 1940. Do you know that?
oh my
1940,
goodness.
the average woman was 120 pounds. The average man in the 40s was 150 pounds.
Wow. And now
Yeah,
actually, now that I'm thinking, I just said that
yeah.
it's so incorrect considering that what's
It's
the average
crazy.
size today? The
I have
average
no idea.
size of woman, I think it's, I forgot. I've been told this before, but
Yeah.
it's nothing like 125.
But it's crazy, right, Erica? That's like absolute insanity in terms of, and by the way, in the 1940s, um, their rations. So like during World War II, the rationing, there was rationing about how many calories people could get. They were rationed around 3,000 calories a day.
Wow,
That's a ton of
it's so,
calories.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
so interesting. Well,
Yeah.
actually, maybe let me rephrase this. Healthy weight, the average healthy weight for their height, their size and whatnot, how much protein should the woman be getting and the man be getting?
Yeah. I think that you can start with 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, and you can titrate again. So if you start at let's actually talk about what the recommendations are. So the recommendations are zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram, and that is the RDA. That's the bare minimum to prevent deficiencies. That is not enough, but that's the RDA. And when we think about the RDA, that's really just thinking about the minimum. Uh, the more recent data would suggest that double that is more optimal. So 1.6 grams per kilogram would be more optimal. There's no reason to think that higher protein diets at this point in time are detrimental. Um, so what one could consider would be 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, just to make it easy. And then they can scale up or down depending on what their goals or needs are, right? So you could say that, you're 120 pounds and you're going to eat 120 grams of dietary protein. This might be too much for you. You can scale down to 110, or you could scale up, right? But understanding that the foundation of your nutrition should be dietary protein, unless of course you're doing some kind of cyclical protein restriction if you're concerned. But that would be a great place to start. 1 gram per pound ideal body weight is a great place to start.
Okay, so I'm around 125, 28, and something like that. So that's 128 grams of protein a day. It sounds hard to obtain. How do you recommend
That's
somebody,
it.
especially talking to the people that obviously talking about longevity, a lot of people do
Yeah.
intermittent fasting. So how does that play a part, and how do you maximize consuming all that protein supplementate? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that much, right? 120, 25 grams isn't that much. So how would one suggest consuming it? Well, I definitely suggest consuming it in a meal bolus amount. So you shouldn't be eating small amounts of dietary protein throughout the day. It should be,
Mm,
two large meals and then maybe a smaller meal.
okay.
Um, so your first meal of the day is going to be the most important of dietary protein, and your last meal of the day is going to be your most important. A note on intermittent fasting, the data would support is beginning to support eating earlier on in the day is going to be better versus fasting and then eating in the evening. I was talking to my friend, her name is Kristen Holmes, and she's a PhD, and she talks a lot about circadian biology. And the conversation is that people are really fasting during the day and then feeding in the evening, and that actually goes against our circadian biology.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It's so interesting that people think that would be better when you're going to go to bed after you eat this big meal. It just doesn't seem logical, I guess. But so how would somebody, when they're intermittent fasting, how would they be able to maximize their protein load? Is there
Um,
recommendation?
so the first meal of the day between 30 to 50 grams of protein at each meal. So if you're going to be intermittent fasting, then you could have one meal with 50 grams and another meal with 50 grams. So you've hit 100 grams right there. You could get in a higher amount of protein. You're going to absorb all the protein that you eat, but for a muscle perspective, you're not going to need more than 50 grams. But if you needed to get 60 grams per meal, that's totally adequate.
Can you overdo on protein and it be adverse effects in health?
It's possible in the future we might find that.
Mm,
The evidence doesn't suggest that right now.
mhm.
Yeah, so the evidence up until this point does not suggest that. That doesn't
Gotcha.
mean, typically we have to understand that with science, there's usually, over a period of time, there's usually some truths that come to light later on. And I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised that there may be a point in time where we definitely know for sure that protein restriction for discrete periods of time is beneficial. I, I, I wouldn't be shocked if that ends up coming out to be the case. And I think that there's mouse data that suggests that that could be promising, but that doesn't mean that that's a way of life, right? Protein restriction as a way of life is, from my perspective, again, with the endpoint of skeletal muscle as ideal, and also with protein turnover. And we live in a somewhat stressful environment and also an environment where we're very domesticated. So you have to protect muscle at all costs. That is, so your question was, do I think that there will be a detriment of a high protein diet? The evidence doesn't suggest that yet, and definitely not in humans. On the flip side, may there be a benefit to protein restriction in some of the mechanisms that we've talked about, for example, like proteostasis or autophagy or um, sulfur amino acid restriction, which is like the newer way of talking about methionine restriction, which is essentially what Victor Longo talks about.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that there is likely benefit to those things, and we just don't yet know how to utilize them effectively.
Right. Right. And so I know a lot of people supplement with protein shakes. Do you
Yeah.
have a preference or a recommendation, like the best source of protein for a protein shake? And I myself, like I said, I eat animal protein, but I do
Hmm.
actually have a vegan protein powder. And now I'm asking
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
should I be consuming something else? Because I always have steered away from whey because of the
Yeah.
lactose.
Well, you could
But
get lactose free whey. You could get lactose free whey. If you can tolerate whey, then I would say whey has some promising food components. It has alpha lactalbumin and lactoferrin. It has these immunoglobulins. Do
okay.
these, and I always try to be as transparent as possible to the best of my knowledge. And um, do we know if these immunoglobulins get into the bloodstream and actually can maintain integrity once they go through digestion? We don't, but it is a promising food matrix. And the reality is it's been around and it exists naturally. Using a vegan protein, I would only recommend for vegans or if an individual cannot tolerate a whey or an animal-based protein shake. And here's why. It is a it doesn't have estrogen in it, the pea products, but it does have estrogen-like activity. And we
Oh,
are now isolating um, a plant phytonutrient that doesn't exist in nature. Therefore, I do have concerns about what this looks like over the long term. Of course, I
mhm.
haven't seen any evidence to suggest that to be true, but just because I haven't seen evidence doesn't mean it won't come out, right? This is a franken food that doesn't exist in nature. And now we are ingesting it in much higher concentrations when better options perhaps are available. That is a bit concerning to me.
Yeah.
So there's
That
that.
that's good to know. So whey would be the choice if you had a
Whey would be my choice. Yep.
okay,
And there's other products that have animal-based products that, like, it's a Paleo Pro or Mark Bell has like a steak and shake. These are animal-based products, which I think that makes more sense. But if someone can, whey protein is my go-to,
great,
and then whole foods would be the second, or whole
great.
foods would be the first, and then if you can't tolerate that, then a whey protein shake.
Great. Good to know because I was so curious about that. And then when it comes to going back to the amino acids and how essential
Yeah.
these nine are for the vegans out there, should they be taking a supplement for those amino acids or like creatine? I recently had an interview and he said that everybody should take creatine every day and I actually didn't even know about that. I've never supplemented it, but I was just curious your opinion.
Yeah, creatine, if you're eating a high red meat diet, you might not necessarily benefit from extra creatine.
Okay.
You should get that in your meats. If you are a vegan, I can definitely see supplementing with either essential amino acids or branched chain amino acids within your meal. So during the meal, not in between meals. I feel strongly that you shouldn't have a stimulus in between meals. And that's where the concept of mTOR and protein restriction, all these things may prove to be important. So if you are vegan or vegetarian and you are having a lower protein meal, that's when you would supplement with a branched chain or an essential amino acid.
Okay, great. That's so good to know. So
And
you're
or if you are vegan or vegetarian, because you're not eating probably a ton of red meat.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to kind of crystallize this whole
Yeah.
concept, like everything we're talking about today, of why it is so critical that we don't restrict our protein, and also why skeletal muscle is so critical as well for our health longevity. Uh,
Mhm.
can you just like put a cherry on the top and crystallize why this is so critical for our well being?
Yeah, of course. Diet. So, number one, the most important thing for health and longevity and really the quality of your life is really going to be skeletal muscle. It's not just at the foundation for health, but it is your physical foundation. Therefore, let's say you have a healthy heart and a healthy thyroid. All of this means nothing if you cannot get up and move. Period. End of story. You have to be able to manage your house and structure as a human. So, skeletal muscle is the foundation for this. And then, many of these diseases of Western society that we're seeing, these metabolic related diseases, have a huge relationship to the health of your skeletal muscle, and that's really key. And then the way in which you maintain the health of your skeletal muscle is through dietary protein, very specifically, and resistance exercise, strength exercise, any kind of and that is the way in which you move skeletal muscle, which is under your voluntary control, is key.
Amazing. That was perfect. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
So I know you have a book coming up. First of all, you have a
Do
new show, which is the
I
Gabrielle
do.
Lyon show. So
The
everybody, of course,
terrible
I will.
name. Isn't that the worst name
It's
ever? I
awesome. No, it's
I had to use that name so that people could find it, but to me,
no,
it was
it's
so ridiculous.
perfect. Once you've built a reputation for something and people know your name, I mean, I don't know if I would like it to be the Erica Lippy show, but but it's great that you could use
Yeah,
your name, and your show is awesome. So I want people to, of course, go follow and find you and listen to
thank
your
you so much.
podcast. And then you have
Yep.
a book that you've written
Yes.
that's coming out
Yep.
soon. Can you
So the
share
book
that?
is called, yeah, the book is called Forever Strong, and that name might change, but it goes on pre-sale in February. And then the actual book comes out in September. And this book, I believe, will change our understanding of obesity. And it will really highlight the fact that we don't have an obesity epidemic. What we really have is a muscle mass problem. And again, an epidemic like obesity, the epidemic kills people swiftly. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing slow, steady, long declines. And I believe that the fix and the origins of this begin in skeletal muscle. So it will re educate our paradigm of thinking.
Amazing. Well,
Oh,
I'll
and a
definitely,
couple other things.
yeah.
A couple other
Please.
things. With my show, there's a YouTube channel, which is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. And if people are interested in applying to become a patient, we have a whole team and everything is
Wow.
done remotely. We see patients all over the world. They just have to apply online. And again, we have a great practice with a handful of highly vetted providers. And if people are not interested in that, they can, of course, sign up for my newsletter, which is free and curated and written. So,
Amazing. Thank you for that.
yeah,
And also,
of
where could
course.
people find you on Instagram,
Yes.
Facebook?
On Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and then my website, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. Same with Twitter and all the things.
All the things. Yes. Perfect. Okay. So, just to close off with my question I ask every guest,
Yeah,
which I'm sure you've already shared this piece of wisdom, but it might be something different, whatever strikes you. So,
yeah.
if you were to leave a piece of wisdom, a life lesson you've learned along in your journey, just something you feel everybody needs to hear right now, what would that piece of wisdom be?
Yeah. It would be that it's the habits of discipline that really make the person.
And go into that a little bit more.
Habits of discipline really make the person.
And what would you say more to that? Explain.
I have the privilege of taking care of some of the most elite individuals on the planet. And they have one thing in common. They are habitually disciplined as humans. And they will all tell you, I'm nothing special, but my habits are just very disciplined. And those individuals that perform the best in their life, whether it's in their health and wellness sphere or in any domain, are incredibly disciplined. They're mentally disciplined. And that doesn't just mean they sit down to do something. It also means that they're emotionally disciplined. They're not worried about what this person said or that person said. They have an emotional discipline and a mental discipline that allows them to focus on the task at hand. And that requires tuning out all distractions. So they are armored against distractions.
Oh, I love that. Such great advice. That's so true. I guess that could, I mean, honestly, I think that applies in every aspect of our life,
It does.
whether it be health, success, business. I mean, that's
Yes.
remarkable. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
This has been
of
an
course.
honor, truly an honor. I mean, so much wealth of information. Of course, anybody to learn more from Gabrielle, please go follow her show, her newsletter, like everything and everything. There's so much goodness. And I think it's so important, like to question the knowledge that's being shared out there that
Totally.
not necessarily the source it's coming from. That's one. And I just want to acknowledge this with you. I love that you say, this is my perspective. So, it's everybody should question the source per se.
For
And that
sure.
really goes to anybody. So I love that you share that it's your perspective from obviously your vast knowledge in your expertise. But I just think that some of the narratives going around,
Yeah.
you kind of, I think you should open your ears to other things and really come to a conclusion yourself, what's best for you.
Yeah, and the real experts will always share. Um, the real experts are always the people that are willing to say, "This is my opinion," or "I don't know," because what there is so much out there, right? I've had a 17-year education. That is a very long time, right? And the more you are immersed in education, the more you see that it is always ever evolving and you
Mm.
learn some foundations, but most importantly, you learn intellectual integrity. And the intellectual integrity is that, you don't become tied to the message that you are promoting. You're tied to making people's lives better. And then
Absolutely.
if it truly is about making people's lives better, then it's okay if protein restriction comes on my radar and there's evidence to support that, right? Because there's value in that. It's not, you always should be wary of the individual who is so tied to a message that it's about them and it's
Hmm.
about their message versus what is really what's in the best interest for the population and the individuals.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah, of
Gabrielle
course.
Lyon. I so appreciate you. This has been such an honor. So great connecting.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks
so
for
much.
having me, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Of course.